Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable position, quiet your surroundings, and allow yourself to settle in. As these stories unfold, I'm always curious to know where they find you. It helps create a sense of a shared, quiet moment, all of us connected in the late hours. So, if you feel inclined, leave a comment telling me what time it is for you and what part of the world you're listening from. And of course, if you enjoy these narratives, a like and a subscription are always deeply appreciated, helping this channel find others seeking stories in the dark. Now, let's begin. First story, The Persistent Itch. It began subtly, a whisper on her skin, so fleeting she dismissed it as a phantom sensation, a stray nerve misfiring, a tiny pinprick easily ignored. But then it returned, a little bolder this time, a precise point on her upper back, just to the left of her spine. A spot infuriatingly out of reach. Simone first tried to ignore it, a silent protest against its impertinence. She was a busy woman, a meticulous architect, and her days were filled with blueprints and calculations, with the precise language of structure and form. There was no room for trivial discomforts. Yet, the itch persisted. It wasn't a surface irritation, not the kind that came from a tag on her shirt or a stray hair. This was deeper, a sensation that seemed to ripple from beneath the surface, a phantom whisper evolving into a nagging prod. She'd lean against door frames, contorting herself in an attempt to alleviate the growing irritation. The rough wood, the cool plaster, anything to press against that maddening spot. The fleeting relief was always followed by a return of the itch, bolder, more insistent. Days turned into a week, and the prod became a persistent, low-grade hum. It was a constant companion, a tiny, unwelcome parasite clinging to her consciousness. She found herself subconsciously shrugging her shoulders, arching her back, anything to bring some friction to that unreachable point. Her focus at work began to fray. A line would blur on a schematic, a detail would escape her, all because a tiny, insistent thrum demanded her attention. She bought a back scratcher, a long, slender bamboo claw. At first, it was a revelation, a crude but effective weapon against her unseen tormentor. The satisfying scrape, the momentary bliss of relief. But the relief was, indeed, momentary. The itch would return, often within minutes, as if the scratching had merely agitated it, stirring it to greater activity. The bamboo claw became an extension of her arm, a constant presence on her desk, by her bed. She'd wake in the dead of night, her hand instinctively reaching for it, a desperate, half-asleep scramble to appease the unseen irritant. Creams followed, mentholated hydrocortisone, soothing lotions, tingly balms. She'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, twisting her arm into agonizing positions, a contortionist of discomfort, trying to reach the precise point. She'd apply the creams liberally, feeling the cool, thick texture spread over her skin, hopping for a miracle. For a brief period, the menthol would distract her, its icy grip numbing the sensation. But as the coolness faded, the itch would resurface, a tenacious phantom, its presence more pronounced in the aftermath of the ephemeral relief. The skin remained smooth, unblemished, a cruel testament to the invisible nature of her affliction. There was no rash, no redness, no outward sign of the torment within. The internal monologue began to shift. From annoyance, it morphed into a simmering resentment. Why won't it stop? She'd whisper to herself, her voice hoarse with frustration. She started to distrust her own body. This perfect machine, this vessel that had always served her so faithfully, was now betraying her, hosting a secret insurgency. Finally, she sought professional help. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with a reassuring smile, listened patiently as Simone recounted her bizarre complaint. Simone tried to convey the depth of the irritation, the way it burrowed deep, not on the surface, but somehow beneath. The doctor examined her back, her fingers tracing the smooth skin, her brow furrowed in concentration. She checked for rashes, for moles, for any visible anomaly. Nothing. It looks perfectly healthy, Simone, the doctor said, her voice gentle, almost apologetic. Sometimes, nerve endings can misfire. Stress, anxiety, it can manifest in unusual ways. She suggested an antihistamine, a mild sedative for sleep, and advised Simone to try and manage her stress levels. Stress? Simone scoffed internally. Was this what stress felt like? A burrowing, persistent agony in an unreachable spot. She tried to accept the diagnosis, tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, a manifestation of the relentless pressures of her work, the quiet hum of urban life. She meditated. She tried deep breathing exercises. She even attempted gentle yoga, hopping to stretch away the phantom sensation. But the itch remained, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath her consciousness, like a distant, off-key cello note that only she could hear. It began to consume her. Conversations became difficult to focus on. She'd nod vaguely while her friends spoke, her mind drifting to that persistent point on her back. Sleep became a battleground. She'd toss and turn, the itch intensifying in the quiet darkness, becoming an oppressive presence in the stillness of her bedroom. She'd claw at the sheets, rub her back against the headboard, anything to abate the maddening sensation. The sedative offered only a brief reprieve, a fleeting dip into unconsciousness before the itch would pull her back to the surface. A relentless siren call. Her paranoia began to bloom, an insidious vine creeping through the trellis of her sanity. What if it wasn't just misfiring nerves? What if something was there? Something unseen, something living, something burrowing. The thought was absurd, monstrous, yet it took root in the fertile ground of her sleep-deprived mind. She'd find herself standing in front of mirrors, contorting her neck, straining her eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of anything unusual. Her reflection, a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger, stared back, offering no answers. She started wearing looser clothing, anything that wouldn't brush against the spot. The slightest friction, even the softest cotton, seemed to amplify the sensation, turning a dull throb into a sharp, undeniable need. She spent hours researching obscure medical conditions, poring over medical journals, desperate for a diagnosis, a name for this insidious affliction. Every symptom she read about, no matter how far-fetched, seemed to echo the sensations she felt. Her browser history became a macabre chronicle of her descent. Phantom itching causes, subdermal parasites human, neuropathic pruritus remedies. The world outside her apartment began to recede. Social invitations were declined, with increasingly flimsy excuses. Her colleagues noticed her growing preoccupation, the way her eyes would dart away, the restless shift of her shoulders. She became withdrawn, her thoughts consumed by the relentless, maddening sensation. The itch was no longer just an irritation. It was a presence, a malevolent entity residing within her, slowly consuming her from the inside out. One evening, the itch was particularly savage. It wasn't a prick or a throb, but a deep, churning sensation, as if something was slowly, deliberately, kneading itself beneath her skin. She was standing in her bathroom, the harsh fluorescent light casting long, unflattering shadows. Desperation propelled her. She twisted her body, craning her neck, her arm reaching back in an impossible angle, trying to get a perfect view of the cursed spot in the wall mirror. Her fingers, trembling slightly, were mere inches away from the epicenter of the torment. She held her breath, her muscles screaming in protest. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on her reflection, on that small, smooth patch of skin. And then, for a split second, a flicker in the periphery of her vision, a subtle shift that made her heart seize in her chest. It was tiny, barely perceptible, a shadow perhaps, or a trick of the light. But it was there, just beneath the surface, a fleeting, minuscule disturbance, a dark pinpoint, a fleeting undulation, like something incredibly small and incredibly slow, moving just a hair's breadth beneath the taut skin. Then it was gone. The skin was smooth again, unblemished, mocking in its perfection. Had she imagined it? The fatigue, the stress, the growing paranoia. Surely it was her mind playing tricks. But the memory of that flicker, that almost sight, burned itself into her mind. It wasn't a phantom anymore. It was real. And it was inside her. The itch, which had been a torment, now became a horrifying confirmation. The relief of knowing she wasn't entirely mad was immediately swallowed by a wave of pure, unadulterated dread. Second story, the peripheral viewer. Ben's world for the past 6 months had been reduced to a symphony of soft clicks and the hum of server racks. As a software tester, his domain was the subtle imperfection, the elusive bug, the glitch in the matrix that others might overlook. His current obsession, and the source of his increasingly strained eyes, was the smart glass window. It was a marvel, a sheet of transparent display technology designed to replace your mundane window with an interactive canvas. Information, weather, news, all could be overlaid onto your view of the outside world, or vanish at a spoken command. He had a prototype, a generous perk of the job, installed in his home office, a compact space tucked away in the quietest corner of his apartment. The window overlooked a brick wall, offering little in the way of scenic distraction, which was perfect for his work. One particular feature, privacy mode, fascinated him. The concept was simple. Instead of displaying information, the window would become a live, mirrored image of the room it faced, a perfect digital reflection. It was supposed to offer a sense of spaciousness, to make the small room feel larger by duplicating it. But there was a bug, a persistent, infuriating bug that caused the privacy mode to refresh intermittently. Not a flicker, not a blink, but a subtle, almost imperceptible reset of the mirrored image every few minutes. It was like a very brief, high-speed photograph being taken and then displayed. Ben had meticulously logged it, noted the precise intervals, even tried to isolate the faulty lines of code. But the bug remained elusive, a ghost in the machine. At first, the discrepancies were trivial, easily dismissed as products of his own mind, or perhaps the sheer exhaustion of staring at lines of code for 12 hours a day. He'd glance up, letting his eyes unfocus from the glowing text, and catch the reflection of his bookshelf. He was sure he'd left his well-worn copy of Dune open on his desk, its spine cracked, a bookmark precariously perched between its pages. But in the reflection, it was closed, standing upright on the shelf, neatly aligned with its companions. He'd blink, look at the actual book, still open on his desk. He'd shake his head, a wry smile touching his lips. Just tired. Another time, his coffee mug, a chipped ceramic monstrosity adorned with a questionable cartoon, was on the left side of his desk. He distinctly remembered placing it there, a habit born of years of right-handed keyboard navigation. Yet, in the window's reflection, it sat on the right, nestled amongst a stack of technical manuals he hadn't touched in weeks. A trick of the light, he reasoned, or perhaps he'd moved it without conscious thought. These were the kinds of small, almost unnoticeable inconsistencies that, when accumulated, begin to chip away at the edges of one's certainty. The office itself was a testament to his methodical nature. Every cable was neatly tied, every pen in its holder, every book alphabetized. He liked order. Order was predictable, and predictability was comforting. The window, with its fleeting, almost imperceptible shifts, was beginning to introduce a subtle disquiet into this meticulously ordered world. One Tuesday evening, the sky outside a bruised purple, Ben was deep into debugging a particularly stubborn subroutine. His fingers flew across the keyboard, a flurry of precise movements. He paused, rubbing his temples, and let his gaze drift towards the window, a familiar habit born of a need to rest his eyes. The privacy mode was active, mirroring his office. He saw his desk, the glow of his monitor, the faint reflection of his own tired face. And then he saw it, in the corner of the room, near the filing cabinet, a dark, indistinct shape. It was tall, too tall to be a shadow cast by anything in the room, too dark to be a trick of the fading light. It was a faint, almost translucent silhouette, like a tear in the fabric of reality. It stood motionless, absolutely still, and incredibly, it was distinctly humanoid. Ben's breath hitched in his throat. His heart, usually a steady drumbeat, began to quicken, a frantic flutter against his ribs. He whipped his head around, his eyes sweeping the actual room, searching for the source of the reflection. Nothing. The corner was empty. The filing cabinet stood alone, stoic and unremarkable. There was no one there, no shadow, no object that could possibly cast such a form. He spun back to the window, his gaze riveted to the reflection. The figure was still there, unmoving, just standing, watching. Its form was like a deeper shade of the surrounding darkness, a void in the corner of his reflected office. It had no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, just a vague, human-like outline. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, began to prickle at his skin. He leaned closer to the window, his reflection staring back at him, eyes wide with a dawning horror. The figure remained, It didn't react to his sudden movement, didn't shift, didn't even seem to acknowledge his presence. It was simply present, in the version of the room that wasn't quite real. He tried to rationalize it. A new bug, a visual artifact he hadn't accounted for. But his mind rejected the explanations. This wasn't a glitch in the pixels. It felt different. It felt deliberate. He reached out a trembling hand, almost touching the glass. The figure didn't waver. It continued its silent vigil in the reflected corner. He moved his head, shifting his perspective, hopping to see it dissolve, to see it revealed as a trick of light and glass. But it persisted, steadfast in its terrifying stillness. For what felt like an eternity, Ben stared, his mind racing, grappling with the impossible. He looked away, back at the empty corner of his actual room, then back at the window. The figure was still there. It never moved. It was a constant, unsettling presence in the periphery of his reflected vision. He tried to ignore it, to force his concentration back to the code. But the image of that dark, silent observer was seared into his mind. Every few minutes, the window would subtly refresh, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker. And with each refresh, Ben would hold his breath, a desperate, unspoken prayer that the figure would be gone. But it never was. It was always there in the same spot, a silent sentinel in the mirrored world. It wasn't menacing, not overtly. It didn't lunge, didn't grow larger, didn't make any threatening gestures. It just watched. And that very stillness, that unwavering observation, was what made it truly terrifying. It was a violation of his personal space, a silent intrusion into his carefully constructed reality. He began to notice other, even smaller discrepancies. A book on his reflected shelf would be titled differently. The framed photograph of his parents, usually straight, would be slightly askew in the reflection. A pen on his desk, one he had been using moments before, would be missing from the mirrored image, only to reappear later. Each time, the actual object remained unchanged in his room. It was only in the reflection that these minute alterations occurred, and the figure was always there, always in the corner, always watching. Sleep became a distant memory. Every creak of the old building, every whisper of the wind outside, sent a jolt of fear through him. He started leaving the office light on, even when he wasn't working, a futile attempt to banish the shadows, both real and reflected. He even considered dismantling the smart glass, tearing it from the wall, and throwing it into a dumpster. But a perverse curiosity, a morbid fascination, held him back. He had to understand. He began to document the changes, meticulously logging every discrepancy, every subtle shift, hopping to find a pattern, a logical explanation for the impossible. He drew diagrams of his room, cross-referencing them with what he saw in the reflection. The figure, always described with chilling consistency, remained the most terrifying constant. One evening, consumed by a desperate need for answers, he positioned his webcam to face the smart glass, hopping to capture the refresh, to freeze the moment of transition, and analyze it frame by frame. He set the recording, then stepped away, forcing himself to look at his actual room to reaffirm its normalcy. He glanced back at the window, a casual, almost involuntary movement. The figure was there, of course. But this time, for the first time, it was not in the corner. It was standing directly behind his reflected self. Ben froze. A guttural sound caught in his throat. He felt an icy grip around his heart, a sudden, overwhelming sense of vulnerability. He couldn't move. He could only stare at the reflection, at the dark shape looming over his mirrored shoulder. It was closer, so much closer. Its form now a little more defined, a little more solid. He could almost discern the slope of its shoulders, the faint outline of a head. Still no features, just an abyss. His actual room was silent, empty behind him. He knew it was. He could feel the empty space. But the reflection told a different story. He forced himself to slowly, agonizingly slowly, turn his head. His eyes darted to the space behind him. Nothing, just the familiar wall, the neatly arranged books, the comforting clutter of his life. He whipped his head back to the window. The figure was gone. The corner was empty. The reflection of his room was precisely as it should be, a perfect mirror image. The bug must have refreshed just as he turned. A wave of nausea washed over him, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. This was no longer a curious anomaly, a mere bug in the code. This was something else entirely, something that defied logic, something that clawed at the very fabric of his sanity. He checked the webcam. The red recording light was still on. With trembling fingers, he stopped the recording and began to play it back. His heart pounded in his ears as the video advanced. He saw himself sitting at the desk, his back to the smart glass. He saw the subtle refresh. And then, for a split second, before the image stabilized, he saw it. The dark shape, standing directly behind his reflected self. Just for a flicker, a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment. But it was there, undeniable. The terrifying realization washed over him. The figure wasn't just in the reflection. It was there, in his room, in the split second before the window's image stabilized, before his mind could fully register its presence. The privacy mode wasn't mirroring his room. It was revealing something else that was there, something that existed in a state just beyond his immediate perception. The refresh wasn't a bug. It was the window struggling to reconcile two realities. Ben found himself unable to stay in his office. He couldn't bear to look at the smart glass, couldn't bear to know what might be lurking in its digital depths. He moved his work to the living room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of his apartment building, the distant hum of traffic, anything to drown out the silence that had become so menacing. But the fear had taken root. He started seeing things in his peripheral vision, even without the smart glass. A fleeting shadow in a doorway, a sudden change in the quality of light. He would spin around, heart hammering, only to find nothing. His perception, once so reliable, had been irrevocably tainted. He began to question everything. Was his reality truly his own? Or was there always a peripheral viewer, a silent observer lurking just beyond the edge of his awareness, revealed only by a faulty piece of technology? He never went back into his home office. The smart glass, still installed in the window, stood as a silent, black rectangle. Its privacy mode never activated again. But even now, when he sits in his living room, surrounded by the comforting normalcy of his life, a chilling thought sometimes surfaces. What if the smart glass wasn't broken? What if it was working perfectly? And it was his own perception that was fundamentally flawed. Forever blind to the unseen figures that move just beyond the veil of reality, waiting for a momentary flicker to reveal their silent presence. And what if, just what if, the bug that occasionally refreshes the smart glass window isn't in the smart glass at all? What if the bug is in him? Third story, what the river asks for. My name is David, and I made the mistake of moving to Havenwood. It sounded idyllic, didn't it? A name plucked from a forgotten poem. And in many ways it was. At first, Havenwood is a town swallowed by the embrace of a river so wide and slow, it barely seems to move. It's less a current and more a vast, silver sheet unspooling through a valley, perpetually cloaked in a damp, earthy scent. The air here always carries the tang of wet soil, of decaying leaves, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies left out in the rain. I moved here 3 years ago, escaping the frantic hum of the city, seeking the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones. Havenwood delivered. It was quaint, almost perfectly preserved, with houses that leaned into each other like gossiping old women, and a single general store that smelled of dust and forgotten spices. The townsfolk were reserved, polite, but with a distance in their eyes that I initially attributed to the wary nature of small-town dwellers towards an outsider. My house sat right on the riverbank, a small 2-story affair with a wraparound porch that offered an unparalleled view of the slow-moving expanse. The river, on clear days, glittered deceptively, but it was the mist that truly defined Havenwood. It wasn't just a morning fog, it was a living entity, especially in spring. That's when it became a thick, white shroud, swallowing the houses whole, muffling all sound, making the world shrink to the few feet directly in front of you. And it was in this oppressive, soupy mist that Havenwood's strange tradition took root. They called it paying the tithe. The first time I witnessed it, I was still unpacking boxes. It was a cold, wet spring, and the mist had rolled in so thick you could almost chew on it. I saw my neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was as crinkled as a dried apple, place a small, faded rag doll on her porch step. A few doors down, Mr. Henderson, the gruff owner of the general store, carefully set out a single, scuffed work boot. Across the street, I watched as a young mother placed a child's drawing, vibrant with crayon colors, onto her windowsill. Curiosity, a dangerous trait in a place like Havenwood, got the better of me. When I next saw Mrs. Gable tending her wilting hydrangeas, I asked her about it. She straightened slowly, her back audibly creaking. Her eyes, usually a watery blue, seemed to cloud over as she looked towards the river, a vast, indistinct grayness in the mist. "Just paying the tithe, David," she said, her voice a low murmur, barely audible over the dripping of water from the eaves. "The river is hungry." I chuckled, a nervous, dismissive sound. Hungry for old shoes and drawings. She turned her gaze back to me, and for the first time, I noticed the profound weariness etched around her eyes. "It always gets what it's owed, dear. Better to give it freely." I dismissed it as quaint, a charming but silly folk custom, a relic from a time when people attributed sentience to natural forces. I was a man of logic, of science, not of river spirits and hungry water. So, I didn't participate. I had nothing to give, nothing I deemed worthy of such a strange ritual. Besides, what could a river possibly want with a worn-out shoe? The spring mist lingered for days, sometimes a week or more, a constant, chilling embrace. When it finally lifted, revealing a world still damp and glistening, I stepped onto my porch to retrieve my trusty garden trowel, which I'd left on the railing after a late-night planting session. It wasn't there. In its place, sitting precisely where the trowel had been, was a smooth, dark river stone, still slick with moisture. A chill, thin and sharp, traced its way down my spine. It was a simple thing, a stone, but its presence felt deliberate. I searched for the trowel, convinced it had merely fallen. I scoured the porch, the flower beds below, the entire perimeter of the house. Nothing. It was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a curious child from town had picked it up. Maybe an animal. But the stone, the perfectly placed, wet river stone had gnawed at me. I mentioned it to Mr. Henderson when I went to the store for milk. He was weighing out some dry goods, his usual stoic expression in place. My garden trowel went missing, I said, trying to sound casual, even light-hearted. Found a river stone on the porch where it should have been. He paused, his hand hovering over the scale. He didn't look at me. Instead, his gaze drifted to the condensation clinging to the windows, as if searching for something in the swirling mists beyond. His voice, when he finally spoke, was flat. The river always gets what it's owed, David. It's better when you give it freely. The exact same words Mrs. Gable had used. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the creak of the old floorboards. He offered no further explanation, no sympathy, just that chilling, resigned acceptance. I spent the rest of that year trying to forget the incident. I bought a new trowel, of course. But every time I saw a smooth river stone, my stomach would clench. The quiet of Havenwood, once so soothing, began to feel oppressive, a silence that held unspoken secrets. The next spring arrived, bringing with it the familiar, cloying embrace of the mist. It was even thicker this time, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the town, blurring the edges of everything, making the world feel claustrophobic and unmoored. Again, I saw the townsfolk leave their offerings. A faded baseball cap, a child's tooth, a silver locket. Small, personal things, imbued with a quiet significance. And again, I refused to participate. It still felt absurd, a superstitious practice belonging to another era. I was an educated man. I wouldn't succumb to such foolishness. Days passed, blurring into a continuous expanse of damp, gray light. The mist clung to the windows, making the interior of my house feel perpetually dim and damp. I started to notice a new sound at night, very faint at first, barely a whisper on the edge of hearing. A soft, wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across a wooden surface. It seemed to come from the porch. I'd dismiss it as the wind or the settling of the old house. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. One morning, After a particularly dense night of mist, I went out to my car to drive to the next town for supplies. As I approached it, my breath hitched. The spare tire, which I kept mounted on the back of my old SUV, was gone. Not stolen, not merely deflated. Gone. The bolts that held it in place were still there, twisted and mangled as if immense pressure had been applied to them, and resting neatly on the empty tire mount, glinting dully in the weak, diffused light, was another river stone. Larger this time, and colder to the touch than the morning air. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through my carefully constructed skepticism. This wasn't some random theft. This was payment. The river had taken something larger, something more significant, and it had left its calling card, a chilling reminder. I went to the general store again, the stone clutched tightly in my hand. Mr. Henderson was restocking shelves, his movements slow and deliberate. "My spare tire," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to control it. "It's gone." Another stone. I held out the smooth, wet rock. He glanced at it, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, pity, fear, resignation, then looked away. His voice was the same low, flat murmur. "The river always gets what it's owed, David. It's better when you give it freely." I pressed him. "What is it? What does it want? Why don't you just tell me?" He finally met my gaze, and what I saw there chilled me to the bone. Not anger, not even impatience. Just an ancient, bone-deep weariness, a knowledge that transcended simple words. "Some things are better left unspoken, David. Some questions have answers you don't want to hear." The town, once a haven, now felt like a prison. The silence of the townsfolk, once merely reserved, now felt oppressive, like a collective conspiracy. They wouldn't meet my eyes. If I brought up the missing items, they'd simply repeat the same chilling mantra, their voices devoid of emotion. The river always gets what it's owed. It's better when you give it freely. And now, this spring, the mist is thicker than ever. It has been like this for 3 days, a living, breathing thing that presses against the windows, seeps into the very fabric of the house. The dampness is everywhere, a pervasive chill that no fire can truly banish. The smell of mud and decay is stronger, too, mingled with that faint, metallic tang. And the sound on the porch at night. It's no longer a faint whisper. It's distinct now. Wet, dragging footsteps. Heavy, squelching sounds, as if something enormous and dripping, wet is shuffling just outside my door. It pauses at the railing, then shuffles closer to the very edge of the porch, directly outside my bedroom window. I lie in bed, rigid with terror, listening to the slow, deliberate squelch, squelch, squelch. It moves around the perimeter of the porch, stopping at each window, each door. I hold my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, until the sound slowly recedes, fading back into the impenetrable curtain of mist. I haven't slept properly in days. Every creak of the house, every drip of water from the eaves, sends a jolt of adrenaline through me. I've started leaving my porch light on all night, but it does little to penetrate the swirling whiteness. It just illuminates the mist, making it seem even more alive, more watchful. Today, the mist is a solid wall outside my window. I can barely see the ancient oak tree 50 feet from my house. The silence of the town is absolute, broken only by the rhythmic plink of water dripping from the unseen branches of trees. I walked to the river's edge this morning, drawn by some morbid fascination. The water was a milky, swirling gray, completely obscured by the mist. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the veil, to see what lay beneath, what could possibly demand such tribute. I saw nothing, only the endless, indifferent flow. But I felt it, a cold, immense presence, a hunger that radiated from the depths. I know what this is. This year, the river is asking for something more, something bigger. The footsteps on the porch are closer, louder, more insistent. The townsfolk's eyes, when they briefly meet mine, hold a deep, unspoken dread. They know. They always knew. I still haven't put anything out on my porch. Pride, or perhaps a lingering, desperate defiance, holds me back. But the mist is pressing in closer, and the wet, dragging footsteps will begin again tonight. I can already feel the chill seeping into my bones, a cold that has nothing to do with the temperature. The river always gets what it's owed. And I'm starting to understand that it's not just an old saying. It's a promise, a terrible, inevitable promise. And I'm afraid I'm running out of time to give it freely. I'm afraid of what the river will take when it decides to come and claim its due. Fourth story, the hum. Michael had always considered his hearing less a sense and more a superpower. While others navigated the cacophony of city life with a blissful, or perhaps ignorant, filter, Michael perceived the world in layers of intricate sound. A sound engineer by trade, he could dissect a symphony into its individual instruments, isolate a faulty wire by the subtle shift in its electrical current, or discern the precise moment a distant train rounded a bend long before it became visible. This acute sensitivity, a gift in his profession, often felt like a curse in his personal life, which was precisely why he had sought out the Zenith Tower. The Zenith, a monument to minimalist architecture and urban tranquility, promised silence. Its sleek, unblemished facade rose like a polished monolith above the city, its double-glazed windows and advanced soundproofing lauded in every real estate brochure. Apartment 14B, perched high above the bustling streets, was his sanctuary. For the first few hours, it was everything he had dreamed of. A hushed expanse of polished concrete and muted tones, where the loudest sound was the gentle hum of his own breath. Then it began. It was barely there at first, a whisper against the vast quiet, a low, resonant thrum just at the edge of his auditory perception. Michael, unpacking a box of vintage microphones, paused. He cocked his head, straining. Nothing. He dismissed it as the building settling, perhaps the distant thrum of the HVAC system, or even the subtle vibration from the refrigerator he just plugged in. He continued his work, meticulously arranging his recording equipment. But it didn't go away. It was constant. A deep, unwavering frequency, like the lowest note on a grand pipe organ, held indefinitely. He moved from the living room to the kitchen, then to the bedroom. It was there, everywhere, a pervasive undertone beneath the silence. He pressed his ear to the wall, then to the floor. The hum seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the building, yet it had no discernible point of origin. It was simply there. He pulled out his most sensitive recording device, a custom-built unit designed to capture the faintest ambient noises. He set it up in the center of his living room, adjusted the gain, and hit record. He sat in absolute stillness, listening to the silence, to the hum that only he could hear. An hour later, he played back the recording. Static, the faint hiss of the microphone itself, but no hum, nothing. Frustration, sharp and cold, pricked at him. How could something so undeniably present to his ears leave no trace on his equipment? He tried again, moving the microphone to different corners, different rooms. The result was always the same, a pristine recording of silence, mocking the insistent thrum that vibrated through his bones. He tried to ignore it. He put on music, hopping to drown it out. Classical, then jazz, then heavy rock. The hum persisted, a stubborn, unyielding counterpoint to every melody, every beat. It was like a parasite, burrowing into the very core of his hearing, making every other sound seem thin and superficial. He turned off the music. The hum remained, clearer now, more defined in the sudden quiet. Sleep became a battleground. The hum, no longer dismissible as background noise, filled the void of the night. It felt less like a sound and more like a pressure, a dull ache behind his eyes, a subtle vibration in his teeth. He tossed and turned, desperate for oblivion, but the hum was a sentinel, guarding the gates of slumber. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with a low, guttural roar that echoed the hum, distorted and terrifying. He'd wake in a cold sweat, the hum still there, a constant, maddening companion. His work suffered. The precise, delicate nature of sound engineering demanded absolute focus, an ability to discern minute details in complex audio landscapes. But the hum was always there, a phantom note in every mix, a persistent drone that blurred the edges of clarity. He found himself making errors, missing cues, his once impeccable ear now compromised by this invisible assailant. Clients noticed his distraction, his frayed nerves. He began to withdraw, canceling sessions, finding excuses to avoid the studio. He decided to confide in his friend, Sarah, a fellow sound engineer with a keen ear, though not as hypersensitive as his own. She visited his apartment, sipping tea, chatting about their latest projects. Michael waited for her to notice. He waited for her eyes to widen, for her to cock her head, for her to say, "What is that?" She said nothing. Finally, he couldn't bear it. "Sarah," he began, his voice strained. "Do you hear that?" She frowned. "Hear what, Michael?" "It's incredibly quiet in here. Almost unnervingly so." "The hum," he insisted, his voice rising, that low, constant hum. "Can't you hear it?" Sarah tilted her head, listening intently. She closed her eyes, concentrating. Then she opened them, a look of concern replacing her initial curiosity. "Michael," she said gently, "I don't hear anything. Are you sure you're feeling all right?" The disbelief in her eyes, the gentle pity in her voice, was a fresh torment. He tried to explain, to describe the pervasive resonance, the way it vibrated through his skull. She listened patiently, but he could see the doubt hardening in her gaze. She suggested he might be stressed, overworked. Perhaps he needed a vacation. He contacted the building manager, a portly man named Mr. Henderson. who prided himself on the Zenith's state-of-the-art systems. Michael explained his predicament, carefully, trying to sound rational. Mr. Henderson listened, nodding politely, then assured him that all systems were regularly checked, that the building was designed for optimal quiet. He even offered to send an engineer to inspect Michael's unit, though he clearly viewed it as a courtesy, not a necessity. The engineer arrived, a young man with a clipboard and a weary expression. He checked the HVAC vents, the electrical outlets, the plumbing. He used his own, less sensitive sound meter. It registered nothing beyond normal ambient noise. "Everything's within spec, sir," he announced, packing up his tools. No unusual vibrations, no low-frequency anomalies. Michael stood in the center of his living room, surrounded by the hum, as the engineer shrugged and left. He was alone with it, utterly, terrifyingly alone. The ambiguity, once a subtle tension, now became a corrosive acid, eating away at his sanity. Was it real, or was he losing his mind? The thought was a chilling whisper that echoed the hum, amplifying his fear. He started to question everything: his own senses, his judgment, his very perception of reality. He began to map the hum. He would sit for hours, a notepad in hand, trying to pinpoint areas where it felt stronger, weaker. He crawled on his hands and knees, pressing his ear to every square inch of the floor. He tapped the walls, listened to the reverberations, searching for a hollow spot, a hidden cavity. He became a ghost in his own apartment, moving silently, obsessively, driven by the relentless, unheard sound. He started to suspect it wasn't mechanical. A machine hummed with a predictable rhythm, a consistent vibration. This was different. It felt organic, like a living thing, a vast, unseen creature breathing beneath the concrete and steel of the Zenith. The idea was absurd, terrifying, and yet it resonated with a strange, dark logic in his increasingly fractured mind. He began to interpret it, not consciously at first, but in the half-waking moments before sleep, or in the quiet lulls of his obsessive search. The hum seemed to shift, subtly, imperceptibly. A slight rise in pitch, a momentary dip in intensity. He started to believe it was a language, a form of communication, a deep, primordial utterance that he was slowly, agonizingly, learning to understand. He imagined it speaking to him, not in words, but in vibrations, in resonant frequencies that bypassed his conscious mind and spoke directly to his nervous system. It was a slow, insidious process, like a tuning fork vibrating against a crystal glass, slowly bringing it to resonance. He felt as though the hum was tuning him, aligning his own internal vibrations with its own. And what would happen when he was perfectly in tune? What would it demand of him? What would he become? His appearance deteriorated. His eyes were sunken, perpetually bloodshot from lack of sleep. His skin was pale, almost translucent. He lost weight, his clothes hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. He stopped answering calls, stopped checking emails. The outside world, with its mundane concerns, seemed distant, irrelevant. Only the hum mattered. Only the hum was real. One night, driven by a desperate, feverish energy, he began to dismantle his apartment. He pulled up floorboards, revealing the cold concrete beneath. He chipped away at the drywall, exposing the metal studs and insulation. He was searching for a void, a hidden space where the hum might be stronger, where its source might finally reveal itself. Dust filled the air, mingling with the pervasive hum. He found nothing. Only more concrete, more steel, more insulation. The hum remained, unwavering, mocking his futile efforts. He collapsed in the center of his ravaged living room, surrounded by debris, the hum thrumming through his very bones. He closed his eyes, tears of exhaustion and despair tracing paths through the grime on his face. And then, in the deepest part of his mind, a new thought, a terrifying revelation, began to form. What if the hum wasn't coming from outside? What if it wasn't emanating from the building, or from some hidden creature beneath the earth? What if it was coming from within him? What if his hypersensitive hearing, once his greatest asset, had become a conduit for something else? Something that had always been there, waiting, a low, resonant frequency inherent in the universe. And he, Michael, was simply the first to truly perceive it. The thought was both horrifying and strangely liberating. If it was within him, he could never escape it. But if it was within him, then perhaps he was not going mad. Perhaps he was simply evolving, tuning himself to a new reality. He lay there listening, not to find the hum, but to embrace it. It was no longer a torment, but a part of him, an extension of his own being. He felt its vibrations resonate with his heartbeat, with the pulse in his temples. He felt a strange calm settle over him, a profound, unsettling peace. The hum grew louder, or perhaps he was simply hearing it more clearly now. It filled his head, drowning out all other thoughts, all other sensations. It was the only sound, the only truth. And as the last vestiges of his old self faded, absorbed into the vast, resonant frequency, Michael smiled. He was finally in tune, and the hum, deep and ancient, hummed back. 5th story, the 3rd floor tenant. Sarah's life was a symphony of quiet predictability. Each morning, the first pale fingers of dawn would stretch across her bedroom wall, rousing her from a sleep that was rarely disturbed. She lived on the 2nd floor of an old, 3-story building, nestled on a tree-lined street, where the loudest sound was often the distant hum of the city, or the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Her apartment, with its high ceilings and creaky wooden floors, had been her sanctuary for nearly a decade. For all that time, the 3rd floor, directly above her, had remained an empty, silent space, a forgotten attic apartment, a dusty echo of lives long past. Her mornings began with the soft thud of her bare feet hitting the cool hardwood, a familiar rhythm as she padded towards the kitchen. The gentle click of the kettle being placed on the stove, the low hiss of the gas igniting, the rich, earthy aroma of brewing coffee. These were the anchors of her day. She would sip her coffee by the window, watching the street awaken, then move to her small, sunlit bathroom, the soft splash of water against porcelain, a private melody. She would dress, gather her things, and with a final glance around her tidy living room, she would open her door, lock it with a double turn, and descend the worn wooden staircase, her footsteps a hushed whisper on the treads. This routine, perfected over years, was her comfort. It was a shield against the unpredictable chaos of the world outside, a quiet, reassuring drumbeat in her solitary existence. Then the sounds began. It started subtly, a faint scraping from above, like furniture being shifted. Then the muffled thud of what sounded like boxes being moved. Sarah, initially, felt a flicker of annoyance. After years of blissful silence, the thought of a new neighbor, with their inevitable noises and disruptions, was a jarring prospect. She imagined a young couple, perhaps, or a family with noisy children. She braced herself for the intrusion, but the sounds were different from what she expected. There were no boisterous shouts, no loud music, no heavy footsteps stomping across the floorboards. Instead, there was a peculiar, almost ghostly synchronicity to them. One Tuesday morning, as she reached for her favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim, she heard it. A distinct, almost identical clinking of ceramic from the ceiling above. A minute later, the faint gurgle of water, as if a tap had been turned on, followed by the soft whir of a coffee grinder. Sarah paused, her hand hovering over her own coffee beans. It was uncanny. She dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of the old building's acoustics. After all, people woke up and made coffee. It was a universal morning ritual. Yet the coincidences accumulated. When she would step out of her shower, wrapping herself in a plush towel, she would hear the distinct rush of water from above cease, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible rustle, like fabric being pulled across skin. When she would sit down to eat her toast, the gentle scrape of cutlery against a plate would echo from the third floor, a moment after her own. The most unnerving part was the timing. It wasn't simultaneous. It was always a beat behind her. A minute, sometimes two, never more. As if the person upstairs was not merely performing the same actions, but was reacting to her actions, a delayed shadow of her own movements. She never saw them, not once. She would listen intently when she left for work, lingering by her door, but the third floor door remained stubbornly closed. No footsteps on the stairs, no glimpse of a face, no exchange of pleasantries. It was as if the tenant was a phantom, existing only through the sounds they made. The routine continued, a macabre ballet of echoes. Sarah would wake, and moments later, the soft creak of floorboards above would signal the unseen tenants rising. She would walk to the kitchen, and the distinct, lighter footsteps would follow, a minute behind. The click of her kettle, the hiss of her gas, the gurgle of her coffee machine. Each was met with its ethereal counterpart from the floor above. When she left her apartment, the soft click of her lock was invariably followed by the faint, almost imperceptible click of the third floor door, and then the quiet, deliberate sound of a key turning. It was as if she was setting the pace for a silent, invisible companion. Her initial annoyance had curdled into a cold, creeping unease. She found herself listening more intently, her ears straining for the next echo. Her once comforting routine began to feel like a performance, a script being enacted for an unseen audience. She tried to vary her schedule, to break the pattern. One morning, instead of going straight to the kitchen, she detoured to her living room, picking up a book. She waited. A minute passed. 2. Then from above, she heard the distinct, soft rustle of pages turning. Sarah dropped the book, her heart hammering against her ribs. It wasn't just mirroring. It was something far more sinister. The shift was subtle at first, a whisper of a change in the established rhythm. It began on a particularly dreary Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was curled on her sofa, engrossed in a novel, the rain drumming a monotonous rhythm against her window pane. She was deep in thought, following the intricate plot, when she heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps moving towards a bathroom, followed by the soft flush of a toilet. A strange, almost primal urge stirred within her. She shifted, suddenly aware of a pressing need. A moment later, she realized she herself needed to use the bathroom. She froze, the book slipping from her grasp. It was a chilling sensation, a cold dread that seeped into her bones. This wasn't a delayed echo, it was a premonition. The sound from above had preceded her own physical need. The incidents grew more frequent, more precise. She would be sitting at her dining table, staring blankly at the wall, when she would hear the faint clatter of cutlery from above, followed by the soft hum of someone chewing. A moment later, an undeniable pang of hunger would hit her. A sudden, acute craving for food she hadn't felt seconds before. She would find herself walking to the kitchen, almost against her will, her body responding to a hunger that seemed to originate not from within, but from the floor above. Her agency, her sense of self, began to fray at the edges. She felt less like an individual making choices, and more like a puppet, her strings subtly manipulated by an unseen hand. She tried to resist. She would hear the faint sound of a television being turned on from above, a low murmur of voices, and she would deliberately keep her own television off, choosing instead to sit in silence. But the silence would become oppressive, a heavy weight in the room, until an unbearable urge to turn on the news, to hear human voices, would overwhelm her. She would reach for the remote, her hand trembling, and the moment the screen flickered to life, she would hear the television above her click off. The fear wasn't of a monster under the bed or a ghost in the closet. It was a far more insidious terror, the fear of losing herself. Her thoughts, her desires, her very impulses seemed to be dictated by the silent tenant above. She started to question everything. Was she truly hungry, or was the hunger planted? Did she genuinely want to read that book, or was the desire merely an echo of a sound she had heard? Her world, once so predictable and comforting, had become a labyrinth of doubt and dread. Sleep became a luxury she could barely afford. She would lie awake, listening, waiting. The moment she shifted, she would hear the faint rustle of sheets from above. When her breathing deepened, signaling the onset of sleep, she would hear the slow, rhythmic breathing of the unseen tenant, a chilling lullaby that kept her eyes wide open. She was trapped in a waking nightmare, her life a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror held by an invisible hand. She began to avoid her apartment, spending long hours at work, lingering in coffee shops, anything to escape the oppressive presence above. But the sounds followed her, even when she wasn't in her apartment. She would find herself anticipating them, her mind playing tricks, hearing phantom echoes even when she was miles away. The psychological toll was immense. She grew gaunt, her eyes shadowed, her once vibrant personality dulled by constant, gnawing fear. One quiet evening, the air thick with an unseasonable chill, Sarah found herself back in her apartment. The day had been particularly draining, filled with a pervasive sense of being watched, of her every move being anticipated. She felt utterly exhausted, her body heavy, her mind a chaotic storm of anxiety. She decided to retire early, hoping that a long, dreamless sleep might offer some respite from the relentless torment. She moved through her apartment slowly, deliberately, each step a conscious effort. She brushed her teeth, the soft whir of the electric toothbrush a solitary sound in the stillness. She changed into her pajamas, the familiar caught in a small comfort against her trembling skin. She turned off the lights in her living room, plunging the space into a soft, moonlit gloom. As she stood by her bedroom door, about to step across the threshold and into the promise of her bed, a profound silence descended upon the building. The usual creaks and groans of the old structure seemed to hold their breath. Even the distant city hum faded, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then it came, very clearly, undeniably, from the ceiling directly above her, a soft, almost tender whisper, her own voice. It called her name, Sarah. The sound was so distinct, so perfectly replicated, that for a terrifying moment, she thought she had spoken aloud herself. But her lips were sealed, her throat constricted by a scream that refused to escape. It was her voice, her inflection, her unique cadence, yet it came from above, from the empty space that was no longer empty. The sound hung in the air, a chilling echo of her own identity, stolen and replayed. It wasn't a question, not a warning, just the simple, soft utterance of her name, imbued with an unspeakable horror. It was the ultimate prediction, the final, terrifying act of possession. Her voice, her very essence, had been claimed. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her eyes wide, staring up at the ceiling, as if she could pierce through the plaster and would to confront the unseen entity that had taken over her life. The silence that followed was even more profound, more terrifying than the sound itself. There was no more mirroring, no more predicting. Only the chilling realization that the tenant above had not just mimicked her life, not just anticipated her actions, but had become her. She didn't know how long she stood there, suspended in a void of pure, unadulterated fear. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. The air grew heavy, thick, with an unseen presence. She felt a cold dread seep into every fiber of her being, a sense of utter helplessness. The apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every familiar object seemed to twist into something sinister. The quiet predictability of her life had been shattered, replaced by an unnerving echo, a constant reminder that she was no longer truly alone, nor truly herself. The third-floor tenant remained unseen, unheard, save for the chilling echoes of Sarah's own existence, a constant, terrifying presence that had consumed her very being. And in the oppressive silence that followed her name being called, Sarah knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never truly be alone again. The quiet horror of the third-floor tenant had become the quiet horror of her own mind, a relentless, inescapable echo of a life that was no longer hers. 6th story, the red line logs, the glow of my laptop screen, was a familiar companion in the quiet of my apartment. Outside, the city hummed a distant, forgettable tune. Inside, it was just me and the endless stream of scanned documents. Data entry. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent, and the remote nature suited my solitary existence. My employer, Oakhaven Retrieval Services, was a mystery. Their digital footprint was practically non-existent, their instructions minimal. Transcribed these handwritten shipping logs from the 1970s. Simple. Tedious, yes, but simple. Most of the logs were mind-numbingly ordinary. Crate after crate of industrial machinery, lumber, textiles. The ink faded. The handwriting varied from neat script to hurried scrawl. But the content was consistently mundane. Until the red line appeared. The first one arrived on a Tuesday. A thin, almost imperceptible crimson stroked down the left margin of a log. I barely noticed it at first, assuming it was a printer error or a stray pen mark. But then I started transcribing its contents. Item 37. 1 grandfather clock note. Chiming mechanism erratic. Often strikes 13. I paused, a faint smile playing on my lips. 13 strikes. A quirky detail, perhaps. A dockworker's attempt at humor. I dismissed it and continued typing. Then came another red line log. This one was even stranger. Item 74. Set of Matryoshka dolls. Note. Number of dolls inconsistent upon repeat openings. My smile widened. Someone clearly had a vivid imagination. I pictured a bored clerk dreaming up absurd inventories to alleviate the tedium of their day. It was almost charming, a glimpse into the whimsical side of bureaucracy. I typed it out, careful to replicate the precise, almost clinical language of the original. Item 112. Crate of assorted mirrors. Note. Reflections occasionally lag by 0.51 second. This one made me chuckle aloud. Lagging reflections. The idea was so delightfully surreal. I imagined a dockworker staring into a mirror, waiting for his own face to catch up. The absurdity was a welcome break from the monotonous lists of bolts and widgets. I continued to transcribe, my fingers flying across the keyboard, a strange amusement building within me. These red line logs were a game, a private joke shared across decades. The apartment, usually a haven of silence, began to feel different. It wasn't an immediate change, more a subtle shift in the air, a sharpening of my senses. I started noticing the creaks of the old building, the distant hum of the refrigerator, sounds I'd always tuned out. They seemed louder, more distinct. One evening, a red line log landed in my queue that stopped me cold. Item 91. 1 wind chime, brass note. Mimics sound of footsteps. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. My amusement curdled into something else. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at my skin. A wind chime that mimics footsteps. The words echoed in the quiet of my apartment. That night I heard them. Faint, metallic clicks, a rhythmic clinking, just outside my apartment door. They were soft at first, barely discernible above the general hum of the city, but undeniable. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat bolt upright in bed, straining to hear, my breath held captive in my lungs. The sounds were irregular, sometimes seeming to approach, then recede, like someone packing, pausing, then packing again. I told myself it was the building settling, the pipes, anything but what the log had described. But the image of a brass wind chime, swaying in an unseen breeze, clinking out the sound of someone walking, was burned into my mind. The next morning, the silence of the apartment felt heavier, more oppressive. The red line logs, once a source of amusement, now filled me with a sickening dread. I found myself scrutinizing every detail, every precise, emotionless description. Item 14. 1-1 ceramic doll, porcelain note. Eyes appear to track movement within the room. I glanced around my own apartment, at the few decorative items I owned. A potted plant, a framed print. Nothing with eyes. Yet, the thought of eyes, unseen, following my movements, sent a shiver down my spine. I started feeling watched, even when I was alone. The shadows in the corners of my rooms seemed to deepen, to hold unseen presences. My routine, once a comforting predictability, became a torment. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, every distant siren sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I found myself pausing mid-sentence, listening, waiting. Waiting for what? For the faint, metallic clinking of the wind chime. For the impossible 13th chime of a clock. The logs kept coming, punctuated by the chilling appearance of the red line. Item 63. 1-1 antique music box. Note: plays melodies not contained within its mechanism. Occasionally whispers names. My apartment had no music box. I'd never owned one. But the very idea of a box that sang out unknown tunes, that whispered names, it gnawed at me. I began to keep the television on, its low murmur a desperate attempt to drown out the silence, to fill the space with something other than my own escalating paranoia. But even then, I found myself straining to hear, convinced I could detect a faint, ethereal melody weaving through the sitcom laughter, a whisper just beyond the threshold of understanding. The detachment of the log entries was the most terrifying aspect. The cold, scientific language, the precise observations of anomalies, made them feel less like fiction and more like reports, like clinical studies of the impossible. And I was digitizing them, breathing new life into these archived horrors, bringing them from dusty paper into the digital realm. I started leaving a light on in the hallway at night. The darkness had become too heavy, too full of unseen things. My sleep became fractured, haunted by a recurring dream of a room filled with ordinary objects, each with a subtle, horrifying flaw. A mirror that showed a slightly distorted reflection, a chair that vibrated with an unseen energy, a single, mismatched sock that seemed to pulsate with a faint, almost imperceptible light. One afternoon, a new red line log appeared. This one was shorter, the handwriting more rushed, almost frantic. Item 19. 1-1 human subject, female note. Exhibits heightened auditory perception, prone to fits of paranoia. My breath hitched, the blood drained from my face. Human subject, female, paranoia. I stared at the words, my vision blurring. The clinical detachment, the stark, impersonal language. It wasn't a joke. It was a record, a cold, meticulous accounting. I looked around my apartment, at the beige walls, the worn armchair, the stacks of books. This sterile, quiet space, my sanctuary, was no longer just a home. It was a stage for the anomalies I was cataloging to manifest. The wind chime, the whispering music box, the tracking eyes. They weren't just descriptions on a page anymore. They were creeping in, seeping into the edges of my reality. And then the last line. A realization, cold and undeniable, washed over me. I wasn't just transcribing data. I was being transcribed. My fingers trembled as I began to type. The familiar cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for my input. The words formed in my mind, precise, detached, just like all the others. The same clinical language, the same meticulous attention to detail. Item, I paused, my mind racing. What was my item number? Was I listed somewhere already, waiting to be retrieved? I started typing again, the words flowing with an unsettling ease. My fingers moved, almost as if guided by an unseen force, replicating the detached tone of the logs. Item unspecified. 1 human subject, female, designated Chloe. Note: currently transcribing archived data. Exhibits increasing signs of localized auditory hallucinations and heightened anxiety. Potential for full manifestation of previously logged anomalies increasing. The sound of my own typing was the only thing I could hear, stark and clear in the sudden, profound silence of the room. A chill, deeper than any I had ever known, settled into my bones. The red line, invisible to me, but undoubtedly present, seemed to bleed through the screen, staining my reality a sickly, inescapable crimson. 7th story, Mr. Giggles' route. There are certain memories from childhood that cling to you, not like pleasant dreams or warm blankets, but like a persistent chill that settles deep in your bones. They are fragments, perhaps, of something not fully understood at the time, something that only gained its true, unsettling weight with the passage of years, as innocence gave way to a more cynical, perhaps more accurate, understanding of the world. For me, one such memory is inextricably linked to the sound of a distant, tinny melody, the kind that promises sugary relief on a sweltering summer afternoon. It belonged to the ice cream truck, and to the man the neighborhood children called Mr. Giggles. Our suburban street was a quiet cul-de-sac, a haven of manicured lawns and identical houses, where summer days stretched out endlessly, filled with the hum of cicadas and the distant shouts of children playing. Every afternoon, usually around 3 o'clock, a faint, distorted rendition of Pop Goes the Weasel would drift down the street, growing steadily louder, until the brightly painted ice cream truck rounded the corner. It was a beacon of joy for us, a rolling paradise of frozen treats, and its arrival was the highlight of our otherwise uneventful days. The truck itself was a relic, a faded pastel green and yellow, with peeling paint and rust blooming along its seams. But its age was part of its charm. And then there was Mr. Giggles. He was an old man, impossibly old, it seemed to my young eyes. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, crisscrossing like dry riverbeds, and his eyes, though often obscured by the shadow of his cap, held a perpetually watery, distant gaze. What truly defined him, however, was his laugh. It wasn't a hearty, joyful sound, but a low, continuous wheeze that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. A dry, rattling chuckle that never quite ceased. It was less an expression of amusement and more a constant, unsettling accompaniment to his presence. It was this sound, this incessant, breathy mirth, that earned him his moniker, Mr. Giggles. He was a creature of habit, always arriving at the same time, always parking in the same spot at the end of the cul-de-sac, near the old oak tree whose roots buckled the sidewalk. We would swarm him, a cacophony of excited voices clamoring for popsicles and ice cream sandwiches. But Mr. Giggles had a rule, a peculiar, unwritten law that he enforced with an unwavering, quiet firmness. He would never, under any circumstances, sell ice cream to a child who was alone. It was a strange stipulation, one that baffled us at first. Why would an ice cream man turn away a paying customer? We'd seen him do it. A younger kid, perhaps too eager, would dash out ahead of their friends, coins clutched in a sweaty palm, only to be met with a slow shake of Mr. Giggles' head. He wouldn't raise his voice, wouldn't scold. He would simply lean out of the truck's window, his wheezing laugh momentarily quieting, and say, in a voice surprisingly soft, "Where's your friend, little one? Can't sell to you without a friend." The child, confused and deflated, would then have to wait, sometimes impatiently, sometimes tearfully, until a sibling or another neighborhood kid caught up. It was a peculiar quirk, one that we eventually accepted as just another oddity of adulthood, like why parents made you eat vegetables or go to bed early. We simply adapted. If you wanted ice cream from Mr. Giggles, you made sure you had company. It became an unspoken agreement, a part of the ritual. We'd form small groups, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 or 4, before approaching the truck. A silent, understanding passing between us. It was a subtle pressure, a gentle nudge towards companionship, almost as if Mr. Giggles was subtly encouraging us to be less isolated. Or so we told ourselves, in the simplistic logic of childhood. Among my friends, Kevin was always the one who pushed the boundaries. He was a year older than me, with a shock of unruly brown hair and a grin that seemed to invite mischief. Kevin was the kind of kid who would climb the tallest trees, dare you to jump the widest puddles, and always had a glint in his eye that suggested he knew something you didn't. He was fearless, or at least, he presented himself as such. The rule about Mr. Giggles' solitary sales had always irked him. He saw it as an arbitrary restriction, a challenge to his burgeoning independence. He'd often grumble about it, muttering about how unfair it was, how he was perfectly capable of buying his own ice cream without supervision. We laugh it off, telling him it was just Mr. Giggles being weird. But Kevin's defiance simmered beneath the surface. He was the kind of kid who couldn't resist a locked door, a fence marked "No trespassing." The rule for him was less about safety or companionship, and more about a test of wills. One scorching July afternoon, the air thick and still, the promise of the ice cream truck was almost unbearable. I was sprawled on the living room floor, half-heartedly reading a comic book, when I heard the faint, familiar melody. I looked up, and through the sheer curtains of our front window, I saw Kevin. He was standing on the sidewalk, a solitary figure, his hands shoved into his pockets. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He was alone. My stomach tightened with a strange mixture of apprehension and excitement. I knew what he was planning. He was going to challenge Mr. Giggles' rule. I pressed my face against the window screen, watching with bated breath as the ice cream truck rumbled to its usual spot. Mr. Giggles, a hunched silhouette behind the counter, seemed to materialize as the music faded. Kevin took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and began to walk. He didn't run, didn't skip. He walked with a deliberate, almost defiant slowness, each step a declaration of his intent. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. This was Kevin's moment of rebellion. He reached the side of the truck, a small, determined figure dwarfed by the aging vehicle. He stopped just beyond the open service window, and I saw him reach into his pocket for his money. Mr. Giggles, who had been slowly wiping down the counter inside, paused. His wheezing laugh, which had been a constant background hum, abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was jarring, a heavy blanket thrown over the afternoon's usual sounds. It was as if the world itself held its breath. And slowly, Mr. Giggles leaned out of the window. His face, usually obscured, was now bathed in the harsh, direct sunlight. I could see the network of wrinkles, the watery eyes, and something else, a stillness, an unnerving lack of the usual unsettling mirth. He leaned closer to Kevin, his head tilted, as if listening intently to something only he could hear. Kevin, who had been holding out his coins, froze. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared up at Mr. Giggles. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear a thing. But I saw Mr. Giggles' lips move. He whispered something. Just a few words, it seemed. They were delivered so softly, so intimately, that they seemed to be absorbed by the thick summer air, leaving no trace. But whatever those words were, their effect on Kevin was immediate and profound. His small, determined posture crumbled. The coins slipped from his grasp, clattering softly on the asphalt. His face, which had been flushed with the heat and the thrill of his defiance, drained of all color. He went utterly, terrifyingly pale, as if all the blood had suddenly rushed from his head. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on Mr. Giggles, but they held no anger, no fear, only a vacant, profound shock. It was the look of someone who had just witnessed something fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Kevin turned. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He simply turned, his movements stiff and deliberate, like a puppet whose strings had been cut and then clumsily retied. He walked away from the truck, his back to Mr. Giggles, and began to make his way home. His steps were slow, dragging, each one heavier than the last. He didn't look back. He didn't acknowledge the truck, or the silent, watching figure of Mr. Giggles still leaning out the window. He just walked, a small, pale ghost disappearing down the street. Mr. Giggles watched him go. His wheezing laugh did not resume. He simply watched, his head still tilted, until Kevin vanished from sight. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled himself back into the truck, and the window slid shut with a soft thud. A moment later, the tinny music of Pop Goes the Weasel started up again, as if nothing had happened, as if the unsettling silence had never been. The truck slowly pulled away, its familiar melody fading into the distance, leaving behind only the oppressive heat and the lingering, inexplicable chill in the air. I stayed at the window long after the truck was gone, my mind reeling. What had happened? What had Mr. Giggles said? I had never seen Kevin look like that. Not even when he'd fallen off his bike and scraped his knee raw. This was different. This was a deeper kind of hurt, a more profound kind of shock. Later that evening, I went to Kevin's house. I found him in his room, sitting on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't acknowledge me when I walked in. His usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, unsettling stillness. His eyes, though no longer vacant, still held that distant, haunted quality. "Kevin," I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened? What did Mr. Giggles say?" He didn't answer. He didn't even turn his head. He just continued to stare at the wall, his breathing shallow. I tried again, pressing him, cajoling him, even threatening to tell his mom. Nothing. He was a stone. He wouldn't speak. He wouldn't even meet my gaze. It was as if a part of him had simply shut down, retreated into some inaccessible corner of his mind. Over the next few days, Kevin remained changed. He stopped playing outside. He stopped laughing. He barely spoke, even to his parents. He would sit in the backyard sometimes, just staring at the fence, his expression unreadable. He avoided the street, avoided the cul-de-sac, and most notably, he avoided the time when the ice cream truck was due to arrive. The sound of its music, once a call to adventure, now seemed to send a shiver through him. He would visibly flinch, his eyes darting towards the window, before quickly retreating indoors. He never went near the ice cream truck again. Not once. My parents noticed, of course. They asked Kevin's parents if he was feeling unwell, if something had happened at school. His parents seemed just as bewildered, attributing his change in behavior to a sudden growth spurt or a phase. They tried to coax him out of it, to get him to talk. But Kevin remained stubbornly silent about the incident with Mr. Giggles. The unspoken, the unknown, hung heavy in the air around him. A week passed. A long, strange week, filled with the unsettling quiet of Kevin's presence. Then, one morning, I woke up to an even deeper silence. Kevin's house, usually a hub of activity, was still. His bike wasn't in the driveway. The curtains were drawn. I knocked on the door, then again, harder. No answer. My mom, seeing my confusion, made a phone call. Kevin and his family had moved, just like that. In the middle of the night, it seemed. No goodbyes, no forwarding address. They were simply gone, vanished. The house stood empty, a hollow shell, a silent testament to their sudden departure. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking whispers and speculation, but no one had any real answers. It was abrupt, inexplicable. As an adult, looking back on that summer, the pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and meaningless, seemed to click into place with a chilling precision. The strange rule, the constant, unsettling laugh, Kevin's terrifying transformation, his sudden, silent disappearance. It all points to one conclusion, a conclusion that even now sends a cold dread through me. Mr. Giggles wasn't just an ice cream man. He was something else. Something that operated on the periphery of our innocent, sun-drenched lives. Something that preyed on a very specific kind of vulnerability. He didn't sell ice cream to children who were alone because he didn't want to sell them ice cream at all. He wanted them. He collected them. The lonely ones. The ones who dared to approach him, without the shield of companionship. What did he whisper to Kevin? What unspeakable truth, what terrifying proposition did he utter that stripped the color from my friend's face and stole his voice? I've replayed that scene countless times in my mind, trying to imagine the words, trying to conjure the horror that must have been contained within them. Was it a threat, a promise, an invitation? The not knowing is, perhaps, the most insidious part of it all. The void where the answer should be is filled with endless, chilling possibilities. The memory of Mr. Giggles, the ice cream truck, and Kevin's disappearance has festered over the years, a dark stain on the otherwise bright canvas of my childhood. It taught me that sometimes the most innocent things can harbor the deepest shadows, that the mundane can be a mask for the monstrous, and that some questions are better left unanswered, because the truth, when it finally reveals itself, might be far more terrifying than any childhood nightmare. Even now, when I hear the distant, tinny melody of an ice cream truck, a shiver runs down my spine. I see a faded green and yellow truck, and I hear a low, wheezing laugh, forever echoing in the quiet, empty spaces of my memory. And I wonder, somewhere out there, are there other children, now adults, who remember a Mr. Giggles? And do they, too, wonder what happened to the lonely ones? 8th story, The Subscriber. Maria's world was a quiet, meticulous universe of faded sepia tones and the whisper of ancient paper. Her YouTube channel, a tiny corner of the vast digital expanse, was dedicated to the painstaking art of photo restoration. She didn't speak in her videos. There were no booming intros, no catchy jingles, no requests for likes or subscriptions, just the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of her tools, the gentle rustle of a cotton swab, the faint click of a digital stylus, the whisper of a brush coaxing life back into a cracked emulsion. Her hands, steady and precise, moved with the grace of a surgeon, transforming blurred memories into crisp, vibrant images. She had started the channel as a personal project, a way to document her passion, never expecting an audience beyond a handful of fellow enthusiasts. And for a long time, that's exactly what she had. A few dozen subscribers, a scattering of comments praising her technique, the occasional question about a specific chemical or software setting. It was a comfortable, anonymous existence, perfectly suited to the solitary nature of her craft. Then came Observer. The first comment from Observer was innocuous enough. On a video where Maria was restoring a portrait of a stern-faced gentleman from the early 1900s. Exquisite work, it read. The way you brought out the texture in his tweed jacket is truly remarkable. Maria had smiled, a small, private moment of satisfaction. It was a well-observed detail, a sign that someone was truly appreciating her effort. But then Observer's comments began to shift. They grew more frequent, appearing on every new upload, sometimes within minutes of the video going live. And they grew unsettlingly specific. On a video where she was meticulously repairing a tear across a landscape photograph, Observer wrote, "Your hand trembled slightly at 3:12 when you applied the adhesive. Perhaps the coffee was too strong this morning." Maria paused, her stylus hovering over a delicate photographic plate. She distinctly remembered that morning. She had made her coffee stronger than usual. A shiver, light as a spider's thread, traced its way down her spine. It was a coincidence, she told herself. A lucky guess. People noticed things. They were observant. That was all. She tried to dismiss it, to focus on the intricate dance of pixels and light. But the comments continued, each one a tiny, precise pinprick of unease. New lamp, observer commented on another video, this one featuring a daguerreotype of a young woman with haunting eyes. The light catches the texture of the paper much better than last week. A wise investment. Maria glanced at the sleek, adjustable LED lamp perched beside her monitor. She had indeed bought it just 2 days prior. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't shown it in any detail. Only the subtle shift in illumination would have given it away. How could Observer have noticed? How could they be so certain? Her studio, once a sanctuary of calm, began to feel observed. She found herself glancing at the small, unblinking eye of her webcam, wondering if it was truly off, if the little green light was truly dark. She started pulling the blinds down, even during the day, creating a perpetual twilight in her workspace. The gentle hum of her computer, once a comforting background noise, now seemed to throb with a hidden pulse, as if it were listening, recording. She considered blocking Observer. The thought flickered, a brief, rebellious spark. But then she hesitated. Observer's comments, despite their unnerving precision, were always positive, always complimentary. They never contained threats, never used harsh language. They were merely too aware. Blocking them felt like an overreaction, an admission of fear she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Besides, what if it was just a highly perceptive individual, a fellow artist with an uncanny eye for detail? She clung to that fragile hope, even as it frayed around the edges. The fear, however, was a persistent undercurrent, a low thrum beneath the surface of her daily routine. It manifested in small ways. She started locking her studio door even when she was just stepping out for a moment. She checked her windows twice before bed. She found herself scrutinizing reflections in her monitor, half expecting to see a shadow, a fleeting movement in the periphery of her vision. Her sleep became restless, haunted by vague, formless anxieties. One afternoon, Maria began work on a new project, a collection of cabinet cards from the 1890s. Among them was a family portrait, a husband, a wife, and 2 small children, all dressed in their Sunday best, their faces a mixture of solemnity and forced cheer. The photograph was badly faded, scarred by time and neglect, a ghostly echo of a bygone era. The mother's face, in particular, was almost entirely lost to a large, discolored stain. Maria approached the restoration with her usual reverence. She spent hours, days even, meticulously cleaning the surface, carefully removing the acidic residue, and then, with the aid of digital tools, painstakingly reconstructing the lost details. It was like archaeological work, unearthing a forgotten past, giving voice to silent faces. She focused on the mother's eyes, trying to imbue them with the quiet strength she imagined the woman must have possessed. She softened the lines of her mouth, erased the subtle hint of worry that lingered in the original, damaged image. She wanted to give her peace, a gentle dignity that time had tried to steal. When the video of the restoration was finally uploaded, Maria felt a familiar mix of exhaustion and accomplishment. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her stiff shoulders, and almost instinctively refreshed the comments section. There it was, a new comment from Observer. Maria's breath hitched. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, even before she read it. She scrolled down, her finger trembling slightly on the mouse. "A remarkable transformation, Maria," the comment began, polite as ever. "You've done wonders with the mother's expression. I always remember her eyes being sadder than that. You've made her look peaceful. It's a kind revision." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Maria stared at them, her mind reeling. I always remember her eyes being sadder than that. Remember? How could Observer remember? This photograph was from the late 1800s. It was a century and a half old. No living person could possibly remember the original expression of a woman captured in a faded photograph from that era. It was impossible. Utterly, terrifyingly impossible. The fragile hope she had clung to, the notion of a highly perceptive fellow artist, shattered into 1,000 pieces. This wasn't observation. This wasn't even stalking in the conventional sense. This was something else, something ancient, something that defied logic and time. Maria felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her studio, once a place of comfort, now felt like a glass box, transparent and exposed. She looked around wildly, her eyes darting from the dark window to the closed door, to the innocuous webcam. Was Observer watching her right now? Had they always been watching? Not just her videos, but her. She tried to rationalize again, desperately. Maybe it was a turn of phrase, a figure of speech. Maybe Observer was a historian, or someone who had seen other copies of the photograph. But the specificity, the intimate detail of "I always remember her eyes being sadder," felt too personal, too direct, to be anything but a literal statement. It implied a presence, a knowledge that transcended the digital screen. Days turned into a blur of restless nights and hypervigilant days. Maria couldn't shake the feeling of being perpetually scrutinized. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her life unfolded for an unseen, unknowable entity. She stopped posting videos. Her passion, once a source of joy, had become tainted, a conduit for dread. She considered deleting her channel, erasing her digital footprint entirely. But a strange, morbid curiosity held her back. What was Observer? What did they want? The lack of overt malice, the continued politeness, was almost more terrifying than a direct threat. It implied a deeper, more insidious purpose. One evening, weeks after her last upload, Maria was sitting in her darkened studio, the faint glow of her monitor the only source of light. She wasn't working. She was just existing, lost in the oppressive silence. Her phone, lying beside her keyboard, suddenly vibrated. A notification. Maria's heart leaped into her throat. She hadn't received a notification in days, not since she'd stopped uploading. Her fingers, cold and stiff, fumbled for the device. She saw the familiar YouTube icon, and beneath it, the name that had become synonymous with her deepest fears. Observer. Her breath hitched. She stared at the screen, a primal dread seizing her. This wasn't a comment on a new video. This was a direct message. a notification of a new comment on her latest video, the one with the 1890s family portrait. But she hadn't touched that video since Observer's last chilling remark. With a trembling thumb, she tapped the notification. The screen loaded, revealing the comments section. And there it was, the newest entry, timestamped just moments ago. It was from Observer. It simply said, "I found the most wonderful, faded photograph of you sleeping. I can't wait to see you restore it." The words swam before Maria's eyes, each letter a sharp, cold shard of ice piercing her consciousness. A photograph of her sleeping, faded, as if it were old, ancient, like the images she so carefully brought back to life. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her gaze swept frantically around the room, landing on her bed, just visible in the corner of her studio. The rumpled sheets a testament to her recent, troubled slumber. The window, still dark behind the drawn blinds. The closed door. How when the air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, a phantom touch that made her skin crawl. The polite, omniscient violation of her privacy had reached its terrifying zenith. There was no escape. Observer wasn't just watching her videos. Observer was watching her. And they had been watching her for a very, very long time. The thought, cold and absolute, settled deep in her bones. She was the next restoration project, and she was already faded. Ninth story, the unfazed. The city, for all its clamor and ceaseless motion, held pockets of profound, unsettling stillness. Mark had always considered himself observant, a quiet student of the urban ballet. But it wasn't until a particularly sweltering Tuesday on the subway that he truly began to see. The train car was a suffocating sardine can, packed with the usual assortment of weary commuters, their faces a blur of individuality and exhaustion. He was pressed against the door, trying to lose himself in the familiar thrum of the tracks, when his gaze drifted. Across the aisle, nestled between a woman engrossed in her phone and a man with a briefcase, sat another man. He was unremarkable in every way, nondescript gray suit, neatly combed brown hair, hands resting calmly on a newspaper. But something about him snagged Mark's attention. It was the way the light caught his profile, or perhaps the angle of his head. For a fleeting instant, Mark thought he saw nothing. Not a shadow, not an obscured feature, but an absence. A smooth, unblemished expanse where the landscape of a human face should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just skin, stretched taut and featureless, like a sculptor's unfinished work, or a mannequin left too long in the sun. Mark blinked hard. The train lurched, and the man's head shifted almost imperceptibly. When Mark looked again, the illusion was gone. Or rather, it had never been there. The man now had a perfectly normal, if somewhat indistinct, face. A slight furrow in his brow, the faint shadow of a nose, lips pressed into a thin line. Mark shook his head, a small, internal laugh escaping him. Too much caffeine, too little sleep. The heat was playing tricks on his eyes. He dismissed it as a momentary optical illusion, a trick of light and fatigue, and turned his attention back to the grimy window, watching the blur of passing stations. Yet the image lingered, a faint, unsettling echo in the back of his mind. It was the kind of detail that, once noticed, refused to be entirely forgotten, like a misplaced key or a half-remembered dream. He found himself subtly scanning faces on subsequent commutes, an unconscious habit born of that brief, strange encounter. He saw nothing out of the ordinary, of course, just the endless parade of humanity, each face a unique, intricate map of experience and emotion. He almost convinced himself he had imagined the whole thing. A fleeting hallucination in the oppressive heat of the subway. Then came the second sighting. It was a week later, a brisk Saturday afternoon, and Mark was meandering through a crowded open-air market. The air was thick with the scent of roasted nuts and blooming flowers. The cacophony of vendors hawking there wears a comforting backdrop. He was admiring a display of handcrafted leather goods when he caught a movement in his peripheral vision. A woman, standing by a fruit stall, was carefully inspecting a cluster of grapes. Her posture was ordinary, her clothes unremarkable, a simple floral dress, a straw hat. But as she turned slightly, her head tilted, and the sunlight fell directly upon her. This time there was no doubt. No trick of the light, no angle playing games with his perception. Her face was utterly, terrifyingly blank. A smooth, pale oval, devoid of any feature. It was not a mask, for there were no seams, no lines, no indication of anything but flesh. It was not disfigured, for there was no scar, no wound, no grotesque distortion. It was simply empty. A canvas never painted, a page never written upon. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, profound silence that seemed to descend upon him, muffling the market's cheerful din. He wanted to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen, but a morbid fascination, a primal dread, held him captive. He watched, transfixed, as the woman selected her grapes, paid the vendor with a smooth, unhesitating motion, and then, with a graceful turn, walked away, melting into the throng of shoppers. He stood there for a long moment, the world rushing back in, the sounds and smells assaulting his senses once more. His hands trembled slightly. This was different. This was not a hallucination. He had seen it clearly in broad daylight, with no mitigating factors. There were people like this, here, among them, and he had never noticed. The thought was a cold, creeping vine, wrapping itself around his composure. For the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent, more undeniable. He saw them everywhere, once he knew what to look for. A man waiting patiently at a crosswalk, his blank face turned towards the traffic. A woman pushing a stroller in the park, her featureless head bowed over the unseen infant. A barista behind the counter, smoothly pouring coffee, the place where his eyes should have been a seamless expanse. They were never grotesque, never menacing. They simply were. They moved with the same fluid grace as anyone else, performed the same mundane tasks, blended seamlessly into the urban tapestry. Uncanny Valley effect was profound. It wasn't the horror of a monster, but the chilling dread of something fundamentally wrong existing within the fabric of the normal. They looked human enough from a distance, or in the periphery, or when obscured by shadow. Their bodies were perfectly proportioned, their movements natural. It was only when you focused, when your gaze landed squarely on their faces, that the terrifying truth revealed itself. And the truth was, there was nothing there. Just smooth, unmarred skin, Mark began to notice a pattern, an unspoken rule that seemed to govern their existence. They never made eye contact. They never acknowledged anyone. They were always looking slightly away or down or straight ahead, but never directly at another person. They were background noise, human scenery, existing in a state of perpetual, benign disengagement. And in turn, no one seemed to acknowledge them. People walked past them, bumped into them, exchanged polite apologies, all without a flicker of recognition for the profound anomaly standing before them. It was as if a collective, unconscious agreement had been reached. As long as you don't see us, we don't see you. This unspoken pact became Mark's new reality. He learned to navigate the city with a heightened awareness, a subtle shift in his gaze. He would catch a glimpse, a flash of that smooth, featureless expanse, and immediately avert his eyes, letting his gaze slide past, pretending he hadn't noticed. It was a strange, silent dance, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of his daily life. The world hadn't changed, but his perception of it had shattered into a million unsettling pieces. He saw the unfazed on the bus, in the grocery store, waiting in line at the bank. They were everywhere, once you knew how to look without truly looking. His obsession grew. He couldn't help it. The sheer, baffling existence of these beings consumed his thoughts. Who were they? Where did they come from? Were they born this way? Were they something else entirely? Something that merely wore the guise of humanity? He spent hours online, searching for similar accounts, for any mention of people without faces, of strange, unacknowledged presences. He found nothing. Only urban legends, creepypastas, and fictional stories that barely scratched the surface of the quiet horror he was experiencing. It was as if he were the only one who had lifted the veil, the only one privy to this unsettling truth. He started carrying a small notebook, discreetly jotting down details, locations, times, the mundane activities of the unfazed. A woman in a red coat, sitting on a park bench, holding a book, her blank face tilted towards the pages. A man in a construction uniform, directing traffic, his arm movements precise, his head a smooth oval. They were so utterly normal in every other aspect, which only amplified the chilling abnormality of their faces. He never stared, never lingered. He would glimpse, record, and then quickly look away, adhering rigidly to the unspoken rule. He understood, instinctively, that breaking it would be a catastrophic mistake. The passive threat was precisely what made them so terrifying. They didn't need to do anything. Their mere existence, unacknowledged, was enough to unravel the mind. One particularly rainy afternoon, Mark found himself seeking refuge in a small, independent coffee shop, the kind with mismatched furniture and the comforting aroma of roasted beans. He settled into a worn armchair by the window, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his hands. He pulled out his own book, a dense historical fiction, and tried to lose himself in its pages. The shop was quiet, a gentle murmur of conversation and the soft clinking of cups. Then he saw him. Across the room, at a small, round table, sat a man. He was dressed in a simple, dark jacket and held a newspaper open, seemingly engrossed in its contents. His posture was relaxed, almost contemplative, and his face, as Mark's peripheral vision registered, was perfectly, terrifyingly blank. Mark's breath hitched. He immediately shifted his gaze, focusing intensely on the words on his own page, his heart beginning its familiar, anxious thrum. Don't look. Don't acknowledge. He repeated the mantra in his head, a desperate plea for normalcy. He could feel the presence of the unfazed, a silent, unsettling weight in the small room. He tried to focus on his book, but the words blurred, his mind racing. He could feel the subtle shift in the air, the way the light seemed to fall differently on that smooth, featureless head. He told himself to get up, to leave, to simply walk out the door and find another coffee shop. But a morbid curiosity, a fatal flaw in his carefully constructed defense mechanism, held him rooted to the spot. He wanted to understand. He wanted to see if the unfazed truly read, if their blankness extended to their actions, or if it was merely a surface phenomenon. It was a dangerous game he was playing, a silent challenge to the unspoken rule. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his eyes still fixed on his book, but his mind was entirely on the man across the room. He imagined the smooth, unblemished skin, the absence of eyes to track the words, of a mouth to form silent articulations. It was illogical, impossible. Yet there he was, seemingly absorbed in a newspaper. The sheer absurdity of it, the profound wrongness, drew him in like a moth to a flame. He risked a glance, a quick, darting movement of his eyes. The man was still there, still holding the newspaper. Mark quickly looked away, but not quickly enough. His gaze had lingered for a fraction of a second too long. His eyes, against his own desperate will, had met the empty space where eyes should have been. A cold dread, unlike anything he had ever known, washed over him. It wasn't the sudden, jarring fright of a jump scare, but a slow, insidious seep of terror, like ice water filling his veins. He felt it before he saw it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the room, a profound stillness that seemed to suck the very air out of his lungs. The man across the room, the unfazed man, slowly, deliberately, began to lower his newspaper. Mark felt his blood run cold. Every nerve ending screamed at him to move, to flee, but he was paralyzed, caught in the terrifying tableau. The newspaper descended, revealing more and more of that smooth, featureless head. It was no longer tilted down, engrossed in the printed page. It was slowly, inexorably turning. It turned towards him. The movement was agonizingly slow, each millimeter of rotation a hammer blow to Mark's sanity. The blank expanse of skin, where eyes should have been, where a nose should have been, where a mouth should have been, was now facing him directly. There was no expression, no emotion, no hint of recognition or malice. Just that smooth, unblemished surface, now undeniably, terrifyingly, looking at him. It wasn't a gaze, for there were no eyes, but the intent was unmistakable. The head was oriented towards him, the blankness facing his own terrified face. It was an acknowledgement, a breaking of the pact, a silent, horrifying declaration. Mark's breath hitched again, a ragged gasp that seemed deafening in the sudden, profound silence that had fallen over the coffee shop. He glanced around frantically. No one else seemed to notice. The barista was still wiping down the counter. A couple was still murmuring quietly in a corner, lost in their own conversation. They were oblivious, shielded by the unspoken rule, by their own unconscious adherence to the pact. Only Mark was exposed. Only Mark had seen. Only Mark had acknowledged. The unfaced man remained perfectly still, his head now fully turned towards Mark, the blankness a silent, unwavering stare. Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His hands, still clutching the warm mug, began to shake violently, threatening to spill the coffee. He wanted to scream, to shout, to demand an explanation, but no sound would come. His throat was constricted, his vocal cords seized by an unseen force. The seconds stretched into an eternity, filled only with the frantic pounding of Mark's heart and the terrifying, silent presence across the room. He felt a primal urge to close his eyes, to deny what he was seeing, but he couldn't. He was locked in this horrifying, silent confrontation, a prisoner of his own fatal curiosity. Then, with the same deliberate, unnerving slowness, the unfazed man began to raise his newspaper again. The movement was a mirror image of its descent, each upward inch of the paper obscuring more of that terrifying blankness. Mark watched, transfixed, as the newspaper rose, until the man's head was once again hidden behind the printed pages, seemingly engrossed in the news of the world. The pact, it seemed, was being reestablished. The acknowledgement, once made, was now being silently, terrifyingly withdrawn. But something had changed. The air in the coffee shop, which had felt so thick with silent dread, now felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, but subtly altered. Mark felt a profound chill, a coldness that had nothing to do with the rainy weather outside. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be the same. He finally managed to tear his gaze away from the man, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign that someone else had noticed, that he hadn't imagined the terrifying exchange. But everyone was still going about their business, oblivious. The world continued its indifferent spin, undisturbed by the profound shift that had just occurred in Mark's personal reality. He stood up shakily, his legs feeling like jelly. He left his half-finished coffee, his book forgotten on the table. He stumbled out of the coffee shop, into the cold, rainy street, the sounds of the city suddenly harsh and overwhelming. He walked, almost ran, without a destination, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. He knew with absolute certainty that the unspoken rule had been broken. He had acknowledged them, and in that terrifying, silent moment, they had acknowledged him back. The passive threat had become something else, something active, something that now knew he saw them. He was no longer just a bystander, a quiet observer of the city's hidden reality. He was a part of it now, a recognized part. And the chilling question that echoed in the empty chambers of his mind was, what happens next? The blankness of that face, once merely unsettling, now felt like a vast, unfathomable abyss. And he had just peered into its depths, and it had peered back. The city, once a place of comforting anonymity, now felt like a labyrinth filled with silent, faceless watchers, and he was no longer invisible to them. The game had changed, and Mark was terrifyingly alone in his new, chilling reality. 10th story, the last stop motel. The hum of the engine had become a lullaby, a monotonous drone against the vast, inky canvas of the night. Jessica gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her her eyes heavy-lidded. Miles and miles of highway had stretched behind her, an endless ribbon of asphalt unspooling beneath a sky devoid of stars. Fatigue was a lead blanket draped over her, pressing down, blurring the edges of her vision. She had been driving for what felt like an eternity, chasing a destination that seemed to recede with every passing mile. The gas tank was nearing empty, and the thought of pulling over on the shoulder, alone in the profound darkness, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the chill of the late hour. Then a beacon, a single flickering neon sign, a splash of garish red and blue against the black. The last stop. It wasn't grand or inviting, or even particularly well-maintained. Just a generic, slightly run-down motel, its sign buzzing faintly, like a tired insect. But it was light. It was shelter. It was the promise of a bed, a moment of respite from the relentless road. Jessica sighed, a long, weary exhalation, and steered the car off the highway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel of the parking lot. The air outside was still and heavy, carrying the faint, metallic scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable, like old dust or forgotten memories. The motel building was a low, sprawling structure, its paint peeling in places, its windows dark and unreflecting. A single light spilled from the reception area, a pale yellow glow that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness rather than illuminate it. She pushed open the glass door, a faint chime echoing in the silent lobby. The air inside was cool, almost cold, and carried a faint, antiseptic smell, like a hospital corridor. Behind a worn wooden counter sat a figure, barely discernible in the dim light. The receptionist. They were slumped slightly, their gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the wall, their face utterly vacant. No greeting, no flicker of recognition as Jessica approached. Just a still, unsettling presence. "Hello?" Jessica's voice sounded thin, almost swallowed by the quiet. Slowly, as if roused from a deep, dreamless slumber, the receptionist turned their head. Their eyes, dark and fathomless, met hers for a fleeting moment before drifting away again. A hand, pale and almost translucent, slid a registration card across the counter. No words, no smile, no indication of life beyond the mechanical movement. Jessica filled out the card, her pen scratching loudly in the silence. She pushed it back, along with her credit card. The receptionist took it, processed the payment with the same slow, deliberate movements. And then, with a soft click, a key card appeared on the counter. "Room 17. "Thank you," Jessica murmured, though she knew no response would come. She took the card, the plastic cool against her fingertips, and turned, the chime of the door echoing behind her as she stepped back into the night. Finding room 17 was easy enough. The corridor was dimly lit, the carpet a faded, neutral gray. The silence here was even more profound, a heavy blanket that muffled her footsteps, making her feel as though she were moving through water. She slid the key card into the slot. The light blinked green, and the door clicked open. The room was clean, immaculately so. The bed was neatly made, the sheets a crisp, stark white. The small table held a lamp and a phone, both looking untouched, almost ornamental. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent of bleach, a sterile cleanliness that felt less comforting and more unsettling. It was too perfect, too devoid of any personal touch, any hint of previous occupancy. It felt like a stage set, waiting for a performance that would never begin. Jessica dropped her small bag onto the floor and walked to the window. She pulled back the thick, blackout curtains, expecting to see the parking lot, perhaps the faint glow of the highway. Instead, she was met with an impenetrable wall of gray. Not the dark gray of night, but a flat, uniform, overcast gray, like a canvas that had been painted over and over again with the same dull shade. It was as if the world beyond the motel had ceased to exist, replaced by an endless, featureless void. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She let the curtain fall, plunging the room back into its sterile dimness. It was just the late hour, she told herself, her exhaustion. She needed sleep. She kicked off her shoes, shed her clothes, and slipped between the cool, crisp sheets. The bed was firm, almost unyielding. She closed her eyes, seeking the oblivion of sleep, but the profound silence of the room pressed in on her, a physical weight. It was the kind of silence that hummed, that vibrated with an unseen energy, making her acutely aware of her own breathing, the slow thump of her heart. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, pulling her down into a sleep that felt less like rest and more like a temporary cessation of awareness. When she awoke, it was not to the cheerful chirping of birds or the gentle caress of sunlight. The room was still bathed in the same dim, artificial light. She checked her phone. No signal. The time displayed was an hour later than when she had fallen asleep, but it felt like days had passed, or perhaps only minutes. The air was still cold and carried that faint, antiseptic scent. A sense of urgency propelled her out of bed. She dressed quickly, her movements precise, almost robotic. She needed to leave. She needed to get back on the road, to put miles between herself and this unsettling place. She grabbed her bag, the key card, and headed for the door. The corridor was identical to how she remembered it. The same faded carpet, the same dim lights. She walked briskly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The lobby was empty. The receptionist was gone, the counter bare. The silence was absolute. She pushed open the main door, and the same gray, overcast sky greeted her. It was a permanent fixture, a ceiling of dull, uniform cloud that stretched as far as the eye could see, offering no hint of sun or moon or stars. The parking lot was still. Her car sat where she had left it, a familiar anchor in a world that felt increasingly alien. She started the engine, the roar of it momentarily startling in the oppressive quiet. She backed out of the space, turned the car towards the main entrance, and drove out onto the road that led back to the highway. The road was narrow, flanked by sparse, withered trees and an undergrowth of dry, brown bushes. The landscape was desolate, unchanging. 10 minutes. She drove for 10 minutes, the speedometer holding steady, the road stretching out before her. She expected to see the highway sign, the familiar rush of passing cars. But the scenery remained the same withered trees, the same dry bushes, the same gray, unchanging sky. Then a curve in the road, a familiar curve. And as she rounded it, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, the flickering neon sign, the last stop. She was pulling up to the very same motel entrance. A cold dread began to coil in her stomach. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the gravel. This wasn't possible. She had driven in a straight line. She had been moving forward. How could she be back here? She checked her phone again. Still no signal. The GPS useless. She tried to rationalize it. A wrong turn. A confusing exit. No, she remembered clearly. This was the only road leading out. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she decided to try again. This time, she would be more careful. She would pay closer attention. She would take a different direction. She turned the car around, drove past the motel entrance, and continued down what she now realized was the only road available. Hopping it would eventually lead to a different path, a different highway. She drove for another 10 minutes. The landscape remained identical. The withered trees, the dry bushes, the oppressive gray sky. The road curved, and there it was again. The last stop motel. Its neon sign, a mocking beacon in the unchanging twilight. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at her throat. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her fingers ached. Every path led back. Every single path. She tried another direction, a desperate, futile attempt to break the loop. She drove faster, then slower, then stopped entirely, hopping to find some anomaly, some hidden turnoff. Nothing. The road, always, inevitably, led her back to the entrance of the last stop. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time seemed to lose its meaning in this place. The sky remained a permanent, overcast gray, offering no indication of the sun's movement, no shift from dawn to dusk. Her phone remained a dead weight in her hand, a useless piece of technology in a world that defied all logic. She drove until the gas light flickered on, a stark orange warning. She had no choice but to return to the motel. She pulled into the parking lot, her movements slow, defeated. The other cars were still there, parked in the same spots, gathering a fine layer of dust. As she walked towards the reception, she saw them. Other guests. They wandered the grounds, their movements slow and listless, their gazes vacant, fixed on nothing in particular. A woman sat on a bench near the entrance, her hands clasped in her lap, staring straight ahead. A man paced slowly back and forth along the edge of the parking lot, his head bowed. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, as if the very essence of them had been drained away. They looked like ghosts, or perhaps, simply, like people who had been waiting for a very, very long time. Years, the thought whispered in her mind. They looked as if they had been here for years. She entered the lobby. The receptionist was back, slumped behind the counter, their eyes fixed on the same unseen point. Jessica didn't bother trying to speak. She just walked to the elevator, her shoulders slumped, a profound weariness settling deep in her bones. Back in room 17, the sterile cleanliness now felt less like an absence and more like an active, oppressive presence. The silence hummed, a low, constant vibration that seemed to penetrate her very thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the closed curtains, at the impenetrable gray beyond. The horror wasn't a sudden shock, a monstrous revelation. It was a slow, insidious creep, a gradual dawning. It wasn't a creature lurking in the shadows, or a jump scare in the dark. It was the geography itself, the inescapable, unchanging, looping geography of this place. She tried to sleep again, but sleep offered no escape. Her mind raced, replaying the endless loops, the unchanging road, the vacant faces of the other guests. She thought of her life before, the vibrant colors, the familiar sounds, the sense of forward motion. It felt impossibly distant, a dream from another existence. Days bled into what she assumed were other days. There was no way to tell. The sky remained the same unyielding gray. Her phone remained dead. She ate the few snacks she had in her bag, rationing them, though for what purpose, she no longer knew. There was no future here, only an eternal present. She began to wander the motel herself. The corridors, the lobby, the small, neglected pool area. She saw the other guests more frequently. They never spoke. They never acknowledged her presence. They simply moved or sat with that same listless, vacant expression, their eyes reflecting the same dull gray as the sky outside. She saw no children, no families, only solitary figures, each trapped in their own silent, endless loop. Sometimes, she would try to walk away from the motel, to find a path through the withered trees. But the trees were dense, their branches interwoven, forming an impassable barrier. And even if she could push through, she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the path would only lead her back. It always led back. The initial panic had faded, replaced by a profound, aching despair. Hope, once a flickering ember, had been extinguished entirely. What was the point of hopping when every attempt, every thought, every desperate plea led to the same inevitable conclusion? She found herself spending more time in the lobby, sitting on one of the worn armchairs, watching the empty counter, the silent door. Sometimes, a new car would pull into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the perpetual gloom. A new traveler, weary and hopeful, would step out, looking for respite. Jessica would watch them enter, their faces still etched with the urgency of the outside world, their eyes still holding the spark of expectation. She would watch them check in, disappear into the corridors. And then, a day later, or perhaps a moment, she would see them, driving away, only to return, their faces slowly beginning to mirror the vacant expressions of the others. She stopped looking at her phone. She stopped trying the car. She stopped trying to find a way out. The realization had settled deep within her, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This wasn't a place you visited. It wasn't a temporary stop on a longer journey. It was a place you arrived. And once you arrived, you simply were. Her movements became slower, less purposeful. Her gaze, once sharp with desperation, began to soften, to blur, to drift. The antiseptic smell of the motel, once unsettling, now seemed simply to be the scent of existence. The silence, once oppressive, became a comforting, familiar hum. She found herself sitting for long stretches, staring at the gray sky beyond the window, or at the faded pattern of the carpet. The memories of her past life began to recede, like images fading in an old photograph. The faces, the names, the places, they became indistinct, less real than the unchanging walls of room 17, less vivid than the dull hum of the motel's fluorescent lights. One day, she saw a new arrival, a young man, his face etched with the same fatigue she had once known. He pulled into the parking lot, his car looking bright and new against the muted backdrop. He went inside, and Jessica watched from her usual spot in the lobby. She saw him emerge later, get into his car, and drive away. She waited, and then she saw him return, his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes holding a flicker of confusion. He parked his car, got out, and walked towards the entrance. Their eyes met. For a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, she saw a question in his gaze, a desperate plea for understanding. But Jessica offered no answer. Her own eyes, she knew, were now as vacant, as listless, as the permanent gray sky outside. She was just another guest, another arrival, at the last stop motel. Conclusion. And with that, our collection of stories for tonight comes to close. The quiet of the room returns. If you are still with me, still awake, I wonder which of these accounts will linger with you the longest as you close your eyes. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.